On a quiet summer evening in Colonial, Massachusetts, as the soft glow of lantern light flickered against timbered walls, a silent revolt was brewing behind the calm. The year was somewhere in the 1740s, when the colony bustled with merchants and shipbuilders, yet thrived on an unspoken cruelty, human bondage woven into the fabric of its wealth. Slavery in New England was less visible than in the southern plantations, but no less brutal. Men and women were bought, branded, and bent to the will of their masters, their dreams stripped down to obedience. Among them was Mark, a man reduced to property, yet quietly harboring something dangerous, the courage to imagine a life beyond chains. Day after day, he moved through the master's household like a shadow, serving meals, cleaning floors, hearing whispers of freedom carried on the wind from distant ports. Each clatter of silverware, each glance from his master, only sharpened the resolve he dared not speak aloud. While others bowed their heads, Mark lifted his in secret, planning something that would defy the world around him, a single act at the supper table that would ignite terror, shock a colony, and etch his name into the dark margins of American history. Mark's life began in chains, though he never chose them. He had been born into a world where the rules of ownership swallowed even the cries of newborns, where a child's first breath could already belong to someone else. His earliest memories were not of warmth or lullabies, but of cold floors, coarse cloth, and the constant presence of orders barked like musket fire. He was never called a son, never held as someone's own, only counted, measured, and priced as a tool in another man's ledger. To those who owned him, Mark wasn't a boy growing into a man. He was an investment, expected to yield labor the way a field yields grain. As he grew, so too did the weight of expectation pressed on his back. Every dawn broke with the same ritual, the rattle of the iron latch, the creak of the door, and the call to work before the sun rose. He swept the hearths, hauled barrels, scrubbed the brick floors until his knuckles cracked open. Massachusetts winters clawed at his skin, and yet he labored barefoot across icy stones, each step biting like teeth. In the summer, sweat soaked his shirt until it clung like another layer of punishment. The work was endless, mechanical, and utterly thankless. He could labor all day and receive nothing but another command to start again. Punishments came swiftly and without warning, as if his masters needed no reason other than their own boredom. A misaligned spoon on the table, a moment's pause when he should have hurried, these could spark a strike of the whip or a slap across his face. Sometimes it was worse, days without food, nights chained in the rude cellar among the rats, his body curled on the damp earth like discarded cargo. The cruelty was not just physical. It was systematic, designed to teach him that he owned nothing, not even the dignity of his own pain. Over time, he stopped wincing. Not because it hurt less, but because showing pain only seemed to feed their appetite. What left the deepest wounds were not the blows, but the erasures. Mark was not allowed to read or write. Knowledge was considered dangerous in enslaved hands. He was forbidden to speak his mother's tongue or tell the old stories around the hearth. Every attempt to remember who he had been before captivity was met with ridicule or punishment, until even his memories grew faint and brittle. They wanted him hollowed out, emptied of identity, so they could pour their commands into him like water into a clay mold. And for a time, they nearly succeeded. He learned to keep his eyes lowered, his voice quiet, his steps careful. He became what they wanted, invisible, obedient, silent. But beneath the stillness, something inside him smoldered. It was the mind, not the body, that suffered most. He lived each day in a strange, suspended state, present, yet absent from himself, like a man watching his life through a cracked windowpane. He could not plan for a future. He was never allowed to dream. Even joy was a dangerous indulgence, for it reminded him of what had been stolen. He saw other enslaved men grow old and gray, their shoulders permanently bent from decades of service, their eyes empty of rebellion, and he wondered if this was all he would become, a living tool, worn down and quietly discarded. This thought haunted him more than any whip could. And then, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. It started as a whisper in the back of his mind, a thought he dared not shape into words. What if he could choose his own fate? He noticed moments, tiny cracks in the order of things, when the masters were careless, when no one watched him closely. He heard sailors talk in the harbor about distant lands where a man could walk unclaimed. He watched the free men in town, men who labored and earned coin, who spoke as if the world itself belonged to them. The contrast was unbearable. He began to imagine a version of himself who was not owned, who could decide when to rise, when to sleep, what to become. That vision was like a glowing ember hidden in his chest, impossible to snuff out. The turning point came when one of the older enslaved men, broken from years of servitude, whispered to him late one night. "They think we are nothing," the man said, his voice dry as paper. "But nothing can become anything if it dares." The words settled into Mark's mind like a seed buried deep in scorched soil. He realized then that survival alone was not living, and obedience would never buy him freedom. He did not know yet what form his defiance would take, only that it was coming, inevitable as the tide. Every insult, every bruise, every drop of blood he had given to men who called themselves his owners became fuel for something fierce building in silence. By the time he reached manhood, Mark had learned to move like a shadow, quiet and efficient, so they would never suspect the storm forming behind his eyes. They still saw him as harmless, as predictable as the turning of the seasons. But Mark knew better. Beneath their gaze, he was not just enduring, he was preparing to reclaim, if only for a single moment, the power that had been stolen from him since birth. The seed of rebellion had taken root, and though no one could see it yet, it was already pushing upward through the darkness, reaching for air. The man who owned Mark was named John Codman, a wealthy merchant whose life was measured in ledgers and land deeds, not in human hearts. To the outside world, Codman embodied the New England elite, dressed in fine imported wool, his boots polished, his words clipped with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He ran a thriving trading business along the Massachusetts coast, shipping molasses, rum, and cloth to the Caribbean and Europe. But beneath the veneer of respectability, he was a man forged by entitlement, convinced that some lives existed only to fatten his fortune. In his household, compassion was considered a weakness, and ownership a natural right ordained by God and commerce alike. Mark was not a man in his eyes. He was an asset, an item in Codman's inventory, no different from a chest of spices or a crate of nails. Codman's contempt ran deeper than his words. He had a way of looking at Mark that stripped him down to raw function, as if calculating how many years of labor his body still contained. When he summoned Mark, it was never by name, only by a gesture, the way one might call for a dog. Meals were eaten in silence while Mark stood by the table, holding the wine jug until his arms ached. Any mistake, no matter how small, a chipped plate, a drop of candle wax on the floor, would summon Codman's temper like a sudden storm. His voice could cut sharper than the lash, but often he preferred the lash. He believed punishment was a tool, not just for correction, but for shaping obedience. And he used it liberally. Mark endured these abuses with a silence that Codman mistook for dullness. In truth, Mark had learned that silence was the only shield left to him. Codman would sometimes strike him across the face with the back of his hand simply for hesitating, or box his ears so hard they rang for hours. Once, when Mark accidentally spilled broth on the hearth, Codman had him kneel on the cold stone floor through the entire night, while the household slept above. The next morning, Mark rose with his knees swollen and raw, and Codman ordered him back to work without comment. It was not just the pain that hollowed Mark, but the casualness of it, the way cruelty came to Codman as naturally as breathing. Yet what burned deepest were the humiliations. Codman delighted in small displays of dominance, acts designed to remind Mark of his place. He made him serve guests while barefoot and silent, standing behind their chairs like a ghost. He ordered him to polish the silverware until he could see his own reflection, then mocked him when he did, saying, "Don't get any ideas, boy. That's the closest you'll ever come to a gentleman." These words lodged in Mark's mind like splinters. Every act of mockery was meant to shrink him, to fold his spirit until it fit into the narrow shape Codman demanded. Mark was not alone in this suffering. He watched other enslaved people on the property, men with backs scarred like old tree bark, women whose eyes had gone flat and distant from years of quiet endurance. There was Dinah, an older woman who worked in the kitchen, her hands cracked from scalding water and lye. Codman often cuffed her on the head if a dish displeased him, once striking her hard enough to loosen her teeth. There was also a younger boy named Phyllis, scarcely 12, who was whipped until his shirt stuck to his skin for stealing a crust of bread. Mark saw these things not as isolated cruelties but as part of a pattern, a system that fed on human misery. It gnawed at him to see people he worked beside treated as if their suffering were background noise, invisible to everyone but themselves. Something in Mark shifted each time he witnessed these degradations. It was no longer just about his own pain. He began to carry their pain too, their humiliation folding into his like waves joining the tide. He could feel their quiet despair, the way they moved as though they were only half alive. It frightened him, not because of what it said about them, but because of what it warned about his own future. He saw what years under Codman could do, how they could grind a man down until there was nothing left of him but obedience. Mark feared becoming that hollow. And yet, alongside the fear came something sharper, anger. At first, it flickered only in moments, small and fleeting, like sparks that died before they touched anything. But over time, the sparks began to catch. Anger was dangerous. He knew it could betray him with a glance, a tightened jaw, but it also made him feel alive again, reminded him that somewhere inside, he still belonged to himself. Each insult Codman hurled, each lash, each smirk of casual ownership became fuel, piling like dry timber in the back of Mark's mind. The day would come, he began to believe, when that timber would ignite. At night, lying on the hard boards of his quarters, Mark would stare at the dark ceiling and feel the war building inside him. One voice urged patience, survive, endure, wait for chance. The other whispered of defiance, of striking back not just for himself, but for everyone who had been made small under Codman's rule. He imagined, just once, wiping that cold certainty from Codman's face, the look of a man who believed himself untouchable. That image was dangerous. It was also intoxicating. It kept him awake long into the night, listening to the slow creak of the house settling, wondering what it would take to stop being a shadow and become a force. By then, Mark was no longer just enduring Codman's contempt. He was storing it, the way a storm stores lightning, waiting for the strike. The decision did not come to Mark in a flash of rage. It arrived quietly, like the creeping of frost across a windowpane, silent, patient, irreversible. By the time he realized he had chosen, the choice had already rooted itself inside him. He would not strike his master with a blade or raise a fist. That would be too quick, too loud. Codman lived surrounded by eyes, neighbors, merchants, servants, all ready to defend his place in the world. But poison was different. Poison was invisible until it wasn't. It moved in silence, just as Mark had been forced to all his life. And if he could not be free, then he would at least be heard, if only in the echo of Codman's final breath. Obtaining it required a cunning he had never been allowed to show. The opportunity came through the harbor, where Mark was sometimes sent to collect shipments. He had learned to listen more than he spoke, fading into the background as sailors and merchants bartered over barrels and bales. One day, while waiting in the shadow of a wharfside warehouse, he overheard two dockhands whispering about rats plaguing the grain stores. They mentioned a powder, arsenic, though they did not name it, that the storekeeper kept locked in a small chest. It was meant for pests. Mark's mind caught on the word like a hook. Pests. That was what Codman called him when no one else could hear. Weeks passed before he found his moment. The storekeeper left the chest open as he inventoried barrels. Mark moved as he always did, silent and unnoticed, carrying a sack of flour for Codman's household. When the man turned his back, Mark's hand slipped into the chest. The powder was wrapped in wax paper, no larger than his thumb. He tucked it under the lining of his sleeve, feeling its weight like a secret heartbeat. That night, he lay awake in the dark, staring at the packet hidden under a loose floorboard. It terrified him, not just what it could do, but that he had truly taken it. He had crossed an invisible threshold. There would be no way back. Planning the act required a kind of discipline that felt almost unnatural, as if he were reshaping his very mind. He studied Codman's habits with the precision of a watchmaker. The hour he returned from his county house, the way he always demanded supper at exactly the same time, the brandy he liked poured after the meat course. Mark practiced the motions in his head, over and over, until they became part of him, lifting the tureen, stirring the sauce, sprinkling the powder, as if it were only salt. It was not enough to act. He would have to appear unchanged, invisible, calm. Any flicker of emotion could betray him. For weeks, he wore a mask of obedience even as his heart hammered like a drum. The night arrived without ceremony. The air outside was heavy with the scent of the sea, and inside the house the candles glowed in neat little pools of light. Codman was in good spirits, humming tunelessly as he removed his coat and laid it over a chair. He washed his hands in the basin while Mark stood by, holding a linen towel, his face composed, his mind blazing. The kitchen felt like another world, quiet, enclosed, every sound amplified. Mark unwrapped the paper with slow, steady fingers, tipping the pale powder into the gravy pot as it simmered over the fire. The smell of meat and spice masked everything. He stirred carefully until no trace remained, until it looked like nothing more than supper. When he carried the tray into the dining room, it felt as though the air itself resisted him, heavy and thick. Codman sat waiting, impatient, tapping the table with his ringed fingers. Mark served him as he always did, meat first, then the gravy ladled gently over the slices. His hands did not shake. He watched as Codman cut the meat, chewed, and swallowed, never glancing at him. Time seemed to distort, stretching thin as glass. Mark could hear the slow beat of his own pulse in his ears. For a moment, nothing happened. He almost believed it would fail. Then Codman's fork paused. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, gone almost before it appeared. He took another bite, slower this time, as if testing the texture. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his brandy. Mark stood still, silent as the silver candlesticks, while Codman's color began to drain, his breathing growing shallow and uneven. The man who had seemed unbreakable, untouchable, now looked strangely small in his grand chair. He pressed a hand to his stomach, blinking as though the room had shifted. "Wine," he rasped. Mark poured it for him, steady as stone. It did not take long. Within minutes, Codman slumped forward, the brandy glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. His body convulsed once, sharply, and then sagged. The sound of his chair scraping the wood rang out like a gunshot. Mark did not move. He watched as Codman slid sideways to the floor, gasping, his fine wool waistcoat darkening with spilled gravy. The master's eyes met his for the first time, not with contempt, but with something like fear, raw and human. Then they clouded, and he went still. For a heartbeat, the house was silent. Then came the chaos. A scream rose from the parlor where one of the women had heard the crash. Footsteps thundered overhead, voices shouting Codman's name. Mark stepped back, letting the tray slip from his hands with a clatter, shaping his face into horror. Servants swarmed the dining room, gasping, kneeling, calling for help that would not come. Someone ran for the doctor. Someone else cried that the devil had struck their master down. Mark stood among them, calm at the center of their storm, his hands folded as if in prayer. Inside, he felt nothing. Not triumph. Not relief. Only silence, vast and echoing, like the space left behind when a storm passes and takes the air with it. He slipped away in the commotion, back to the kitchen where the fire still burned low. The ladle lay on the table, clean, gleaming. He picked it up and placed it back on its hook, careful, deliberate, as though it were the most ordinary task in the world. Upstairs, feet pounded. A door slammed. Someone shouted that Codman was dead. Mark straightened his back. For the first time in his life, no one called his name. The morning after the poisoned supper, the Townsend household stood still as a tomb. The once commanding voice of Captain John Townsend had gone silent, replaced by whispers and muffled cries that clung to the corridors like smoke after a fire. Servants avoided each other's eyes. and neighbors crowded the edges of the property, murmuring about foul play. It didn't take long for suspicion to settle on Mark. He was the closest to the master, the one who had served the final dish, and in the cold logic of colonial Massachusetts, guilt came easily to those in chains. Within hours, local magistrates arrived, their boots crunching on the gravel path as they stepped into the house like predators entering a snare. They questioned every servant, inspected the kitchen, and peered into Mark's meager quarters as if the walls themselves might confess. He was seized without ceremony, wrists bound in iron, and marched out before the gathering crowd. Some gasped, others jeered, but most simply stared with that peculiar New England coldness, a gaze that could cut deeper than any blade. The investigation, swift and merciless, was less about truth and more about restoring order, proving to the town that even whispers of rebellion would be crushed before they could echo. The colonial courtroom where Mark was delivered was less a temple of justice than a theater of fear. High-backed wooden benches loomed like gallows, and the air smelled of ink, damp wool, and judgment. The judges were men of property, men who believed in hierarchy as naturally as they believed in gravity. Their powdered wigs framed faces etched with suspicion. In that space, Mark was not seen as a man but as a danger contained within flesh, a spark that could set their orderly world aflame. Witnesses filed in one after another, each testimony stitching together a noose of words. A cook swore she had seen Mark lingering near the pantry hours before the supper. Another servant recalled a strange bitterness in the master's wine. The town physician spoke gravely about symptoms of poisoning, though he admitted the signs were subtle. No physical evidence was produced. There rarely was in such cases. But in the eyes of the court, evidence was secondary to preserving the illusion of control. When Mark was finally allowed to speak, the courtroom went still. He stood shackled, shoulders squared yet trembling, and addressed the judges in a voice neither defiant nor submissive, merely tired, like an old tree creaking in the wind. At first, he denied the charge. He said he had only served as ordered, that he bore no hatred, that a slave could have no motives because he had no freedom. The room erupted in scoffs. But as the proceedings dragged on, as the accusations grew heavier and the stares more venomous, something inside him cracked. He confessed, not in a burst of rage, but in a whisper, like releasing a secret that had poisoned him long before he poisoned his master. He spoke of years of humiliation, of being treated as furniture, as livestock, as shadow. He said he had dreamed, just once, of being free of the man who owned him. That dream, he said, had turned into a plan, and the plan into the deed. There was no triumph in his words, only exhaustion. His confession, instead of awakening sympathy, hardened the courtroom like frost over a grave. Outside the courthouse, word of his confession spread through town like wildfire. Merchants paused mid-transaction to trade rumors. Housewives clutched their children closer. Sailors in the taverns cursed under their breath. The idea that a slave, a silent, compliant figure in their everyday scenery, had dared to strike down a white master filled them not only with outrage but with dread. It was as though the ground beneath their neatly ordered lives had shifted, hinting at chaos waiting just below the surface. The racial prejudice of the time sharpened every reaction. Newspapers called Mark unnatural and corrupted. Preachers thundered that his act was the devil's work, proof that Africans were born wicked and needed chains to restrain them. Some even claimed that if he were spared, other slaves might rise and spill blood across the colony. Fear did what evidence could not, it sealed Mark's fate. In the end, his trial was less about justice than making an example. The court did not ask if a man driven to desperation by years of cruelty might seek freedom by the only means left to him. It asked how swiftly they could erase the memory of his rebellion. The verdict was declared with ceremonial coldness: guilty of murder, guilty of betrayal, guilty of daring to imagine himself as anything more than property. As the gavel struck, the crowd exhaled in a hiss, like a single living thing. Mark stood motionless. The iron around his wrists rattled softly as he lowered his head, not in shame but in resignation. He had gambled his life on one act of defiance, and the colony had answered with the full weight of its fear. His story was no longer his, it belonged to their need for order, their terror of change. And yet, as he was led away from the courtroom, some swore they saw a strange calm settle over his face. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was pride. Or perhaps, in that fleeting moment, he understood that even in defeat, he had pierced the illusion of their control. For a single night, in a quiet Massachusetts household, a man they called a slave had made the mighty tremble. And that they feared most of all. The morning of Mark's execution dawned cold and gray, as if even the sun recoiled from what was about to unfold. A damp wind swept through the streets of Boston, carrying the smell of the harbor and the low murmur of gathering crowds. By mid-morning, hundreds had assembled in the square, pressing shoulder to shoulder around the wooden scaffold that had been erected overnight. Children perched on barrels for a better view. Merchants closed their shops. Church bells tolled in long, solemn waves. The colony had dressed the day in ritual, turning death into a public spectacle, as if to remind every watching soul who ruled and who obeyed. Mark was led from his cell in chains, flanked by guards who marched stiff and silent, their muskets glinting dully in the muted light. He walked with a steady, almost unreal composure. Gone was the haunted, restless man from the trial. What remained was something quieter, perhaps resignation, perhaps defiance worn thin into peace. His clothes were simple and clean, a white shirt and rough trousers, as though he had already been stripped of every identity except that of the condemned. The crowd parted in uneasy silence as he approached the scaffold, the iron around his ankles clinking with each step like a fading heartbeat. At the base of the gallows, a minister muttered prayers about repentance and eternal mercy. Mark listened without raising his eyes. He had heard the words before, words that had done nothing to stop the lash or lighten the chains. When asked if he had any final words, he paused long enough for the crowd to lean forward, breaths held. Then, quietly, he said, "You can kill the body. You will never own the soul." It was not shouted or rehearsed. It was simply offered, like the last ember from a dying fire. Some in the crowd flinched, as if the sentence itself were a blow. The hangman placed the rope around his neck. The rough hemp dug into his skin. A hush swept the square, thick as fog. For a heartbeat, even the gulls circling above seemed to stop. And then the trapdoor dropped. The sound was brutal in its simplicity. Wood slamming against wood, the sharp crack of finality. Mark's body jerked once, then hung still, swaying slightly in the salt wind. No cries rose from the crowd. No applause. Just a vast, uncomfortable silence, the kind that settles when a truth too large to name brushes the edge of consciousness. Officials declared justice served. The crowd slowly dispersed, their faces pale and set, like people waking from a nightmare they had chosen to watch. But the intended message, the cold lesson the colony hoped to burn into every enslaved mind, was unmistakable. This is what happens when you forget your place. The gallows had been built not only to kill Mark, but to kill the very idea that a man in chains might dare to dream of freedom. Yet, paradoxically, that was the idea that survived him. In the weeks that followed, townsfolk whispered his name in taverns and marketplaces, their voices lowered though their eyes glimmered with something like unease. Some said he had died like a fool, chasing freedom he could never grasp. Others, more quietly, said he had died like a man. Children dared each other to sneak near the scaffold at night, claiming they could feel his spirit in the boards. Among the enslaved, his story spread like smoke, slipping through locked doors and guarded fields. They spoke of him not as a murderer, but as someone who had seized, for a single fleeting night, the power to choose his fate. Over the years, Mark's name faded from the ledgers and official records, buried under the colony's endless arithmetic of trade, births, and deaths. But he never quite vanished. His act lingered in the local memory like a ghost, resurfacing in scraps of gossip, in the tight-lipped warnings of masters to their servants, in the unease that stirred whenever the subject of rebellion arose. Even long after Massachusetts quietly erased slavery from its laws, his story endured in the margins, as if history itself could not decide whether to condemn him or mourn him. For the entrepreneurs, dreamers, and rebels who came generations later, Mark's life offers no easy moral. It is not a story of triumph. It is not even, strictly speaking, a story of justice. It is the story of a man born into a world that denied his humanity, who chose, at the ultimate cost, to assert it anyway. In that choice lies something deeply unsettling, yet profoundly human, the refusal to accept a life stripped of dignity, even if the price of reclaiming it is death. On the scaffold, the colony saw only a criminal. But history, in its slow and complicated mercy, sometimes recognizes what the living cannot. And so Mark remains, not as a name etched on a monument, but as a shadow that still walks the edges of Massachusetts lore. The man who served supper. The man who poured the poison. The man who stood, for one brief moment, taller than the gallows they built to erase him. In the quiet that followed Mark's death, the colony tried to move on, burying his name beneath ledgers and sermons, as if silence could erase what he had done. Yet his story lingers, not because he was victorious, but because he dared to stand at all. He had nothing, no wealth, no power, not even ownership of his own body, yet he found the will to challenge the order of his world. That defiance cost him everything. And still, across the centuries, it whispers to us, freedom has always demanded more than comfort. It has demanded courage, even from those with nothing left to lose. Mark's rebellion was brief, and its price was final, but it cracked the illusion that oppression could last forever. His act was not just a desperate bid for survival. It was the ember of a fire that would one day burn through chains, laws, and centuries of silence. Every movement toward liberty, every voice that rose where it was told to be quiet, has carried something of him forward. If his story moved you, let it not end here. Keep it alive. Share it. Talk about it. And if you want to uncover more of these buried histories, more voices the world tried to forget, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and pass it on. Because the past is not gone, it waits for those willing to listen and to remember.